Hello. Welcome to the webinar on Process Dispatch Framework. This webinar consists of two sections. We start with introduction to the framework followed by hands-on. So let's get started. Process Dispatch Framework is a collection of processes, visual business objects, work queues and environment variables that can be used to provide a means for launching Blue Prism processes asynchronously via SOAP request and receiving process results either through polling or a callback. This framework includes the following components. Two visual business objects, namely Utility Process Dispatcher and Template Process Callback. A process called Dispatched Process Monitor. Environment variables and work queues. The Utility Process Dispatcher is a VBO that is exposed as a web service and used to invoke a Blue Prism process asynchronously. We will be seeing how to expose object as web service in the hands-on section. Template Process Callback is a template VBO to configure the callback action. To invoke a process in your Blue Prism environment, you need to pass in the name of the BP process, its associated parameters and callback information. This object gets the process details and invokes the process via command prompt, updating the work queue and also returns a session ID. The callback action is executed upon completion of your process execution. Dispatched Process Monitor is a process used to periodically check processes that were started via the Process Dispatcher VBO to determine if they have completed. It can be scheduled to run on a 5 to 10 minute interval, which keeps querying the database for the completion of the session which was initiated by the Process Dispatcher earlier. Once the session execution is complete, it triggers the Process Callback object with the requested action. The usage of callback feature is optional depending on the usage scenario. Process Dispatcher Resource Pool is the name of the resource pool the framework will use when executing processes. This framework relies on the use of a resource pool to support the execution of multiple processes in parallel. It is recommended that you create a dedicated resource pool with enough runtime resources to handle your projected volume of concurrent processes. For testing purposes, you may configure the resource pool with a single resource PC. Queue dispatched processes is a variable that holds the name of the work queue that keeps track of processes launched via the framework. Dispatched processes is a work queue used by the Process Dispatcher VBO and Dispatched Process Monitor process to keep track of processes that have been launched via the framework. This graphics provides a high-level conceptual view of how the framework functions. The bottom part of the graphics shows the dispatcher event. The Process Dispatcher VBO is invoked via a SOAP request, which in turn triggers the process execution using Automate C. Automate C is a command line utility included with Blue Prism. This command triggers the process and returns the session ID, which is added by the framework onto the dispatched processes work queue. The top part of the graphics shows the monitoring and callback event. The dispatched process monitor is scheduled at a defined frequency of, let's say, 10 minutes. It retrieves the session ID from the word queue and checks the status of the running process by querying the database. If the process is found to be completed, then it triggers the callback action, else the completion status will be checked again in the next scheduled run. In the following section we will be doing hands-on for setting up the Process Dispatcher framework. So let's get started. The hands-on is divided into 5 steps. The first step is the import additional VBOs which are required for the framework. Steps 2, 3 and 4 are required to set up required access for the Blue Prism user accounts. And finally step 5 is where we will be setting up the framework and doing a test run. Let's import the dependent VBOs. Make sure that you have Utility JSON and Data SQL Server VBOs imported from your Blue Prism installation folder. Process Information Utility can be obtained from the Blue Prism Digital Exchange. Navigate to Digital Exchange and search for Process Info. Clicking on Link to Asset will navigate you to the GitHub page where you can download the repository. Extract the zip file at the downloaded path. Next, import the XML file onto your environment. Next, we will be setting up the Blue Prism user account, which will be used to invoke the Exposed Dispatcher VBO web service. Navigate to System Users. Go to Create User, enter a name and password. Leaving the default settings here. Select the role Web Service Consumers and click Finish. The web service user is now successfully created. Next, we will be setting up. Navigate to System Users. Go to Create Users. Enter a name and password. Leaving the default settings here. Select the role runtime resource. The runtime user is now successfully created. Next, we will be setting up a user credential defined on the Blue Prism database. This credential requires read-only access to the database. If you are unfamiliar with creating user accounts within SQL Server or don't have required permissions, check with your local SQL Server database administrator. Open SQL Management Studio. Under Security, go to New Login. Select SQL Authentication. Enter login name and password. Navigate to User Mapping. Select the database and role. The database user is now successfully created. Navigate to Blue Prism Digital Exchange Portal. Log in with your Blue Prism Portal ID. Search for the Process Dispatch Framework. Download the asset to your local folder and unzip it. Now, log in to your Blue Prism application. Go to File menu, import the Process Dispatch Framework BP release file. Navigate to the Resource Pool screen. Click the New Pool button to create a resource pool for Dispatch Framework. Enter the resource pool name, Dispatched Process Pool. Drag the available runtime resources into the pool from the left. Next, go to the Objects Exposure screen. Click Expose a Business Object and select Object Utility Blue Prism Process Info to expose it as Web Services. Repeat the steps for Object Utility Process Dispatcher. Enter the Web Services URL and verify if the Web Services is online. Now, we navigate to the user's maintenance screen and add a new user called Process Monitor. Grant the user System Administrator role. Next, we proceed to Security Credentials to create a Blue Prism credential. Enter the username and password of the user we have just created. Select all for security roles, processes and resources. Repeat the steps and create another credential called DB read-only user. Enter the database username and password we created in the previous slides. Select the security roles, processes and resources. Now, go to Environment Variables to set up the database name and database server name. Let's create a sample process. Open the process. Define a text message as the input parameters. Set the text message as the output. Publish and save the process. Open the template process callback object. Create a code stage in page execute callback. Add process result as the input parameters. Include the line of code to print out the text in the window message box. Save and close the object. Open up your SOAP UI application. Create a new SOAP project for the Utility Process Dispatcher. Create a SOAP request for action run process. Fill up the BP instance, use SSO, BP credential name, process name, parameters and finally resource pool name. Include a basic authentication header for the request. Fire the request and observe in Blue Prism control room. You will notice there is a new running process of Utility Process Dispatcher and following by the sample process. Both process should be completed after sometimes and you should receive a response body with the process info in SOAP UI. Navigate to Scheduler screen. Create a new recurring schedule for process monitoring. Create a new task. Select Dispatched Process Pool as the dedicated resources for Dispatched Process Monitor process. Set up the recurring interval and apply the changes. Observe in the Runtime Resource screen, and you will notice the Dispatched Process Monitor process is triggered and it will execute the callback that we have configured in earlier slides. Thank you for watching Process Dispatched Framework Training.